You do, but these people don't.
I told you that shit was.
No. I'm sorry, y'all. Why am I upset? Okay. I went to Lowe's today, and the cashier was speaking Spanish. I particularly don't enjoy speaking Spanish in my country.
This has nothing to do with you now. It has something to do with losing our country. And we don't want to do that. And you people are destroying it.
Hey, where you from, man?
Hey, you guys, ignore him.
Where the fuck you from, dude?
Ignore him.
I'm from Jalisco, Mexico. That's what I'm from. Go back to Mexico, you fucking coward.
He's the group.
I'm the coward. You're the fucking coward. How am I a coward? I'm here by myself. I'm surrounded by Minutemen and I'm the coward.
What would happen if we went into your group?
You're a fucking coward. You come here to mooch off in this country. Why don't you go fix your own country?
You do.
You got no balls, huh? Beyond, you got no fucking white. Where am I then? I'm indigenous to the continent. I'm indigenous to the continent. I'm indigenous to the continent.
Go home. Where's your pride?
What business?
Go home.
I'm indigenous to this continent.
Where does this hate originate from? Many Mexicans have immigrated to the United States in hope of attaining the American dream. The Mexican-American conflict began in 1845 with the U.S. annexation of Texas and the dispute whether Texas ended up in the Nueces River or the Rio Grande. The Mexican-American War began and soon ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave the U.S. a significant portion of Mexican territory in 1848. This colonization of Mexican land and people was just the beginning of discrimination and assimilation of Mexican Americans. But it was not until the 20th century that the presence of Mexican Americans had a more significant impact on the mainstream U.S. culture. The immigration brought about by Mexican communities was encouraged sometimes and unwanted at others. The Great Depression of the 1930s prompted state and federal officials to expel legal and non-citizen residents, claiming that Mexican Americans were an economic burden. During this same decade of discrimination, the young Mexicans in California created their own youth culture, adopting their own music, language, and style of dress known as the zoot suit. These zoot suiters became known as Pachucos. In the 1940s, many arrests and negative stories in the LA Times fueled the pessimistic perception of Pachuco gangs, which inflamed a widespread public backlash against Mexicans. These stereotypes worsened in 1942 with the Sleepy Lagoon case, in which 22 teenagers were tried with the killing of another Mexican teenager at a party, causing Los Angeles to erupt in riots that scared race relations for decades to come. A series of violent incidents erupted between zoot suiters and U.S. servicemen throughout California, with the most serious of these acts broke out in Los Angeles, in which armed soldiers violently raided Mexican-American neighborhoods in search of the young zoot suiter, causing the Pachucos to strike back. The police, rather than arresting the sailors, tooled the Pachucos into custody. The 10 days of Los Angeles zoot suit riots came to an end after military personnel intervened and City Council issued an ordinance banning all zoot suits. The stereotype of disloyal Mexican Americans continued on for decades to come. As the zoot suit riots of 1943 show, integration has not been easy due to racial discrimination.
My name is Joe Ruiz.
My name is Genevieve Lopez, maiden name, married name, Ruiz.
I'm from Chino, California. That's 45 miles east of Los Angeles. Yes, but I went with the flow. I couldn't do anything about it, and most of the time I was running because I didn't want to get beat up. They wouldn't let the Mexicans go into the swimming pool unless all the other kids had used the pool, and they figured the water was dirty. So then they would let us go in like on a Thursday and a Friday, and then they would treat the water or whatever, but I could care less as long as I could jump in the water and have a good time.
Oh yes, I didn't learn English until I started going to school. So I was a very unhappy little girl going to school. I remember my oldest sister taking me there, Carmen. She was like my second mom. And she dropped me off and everything. I just decided I don't want to be here. And I took off. I left and I went home, not letting them know where so there was quite an ordeal over that because I just took off. I didn't want to be there. And I cried and cried and cried and cried. I did not want to be there. It was very hard for me because, and for all of us, because I wasn't the only Mexican little girl there. There were many, many. And they must have been just as miserable as I because no Spanish was to be heard. You had to, all these teachers, we want to hear English, no Spanish, and that was it. So we had to learn the hard way.
It was definitely different as I grew up. Some people, of course, were prejudiced, and they had, where I was growing up, they had two schools. They had one for the Mexicans and one for the white folks. And now that I'm older and I realize why, I didn't blame them, but that's the way it was. I went where the school where the white kids went. So I had a problem with the white kids and I had a problem with the Mexicans because they thought I was buttering up to the whites, and then the Mexicans didn't like it. And of course, the whites didn't like me, so I was the only Mexican in that school. When I was in like third, fourth, fifth, and then when I went to high school, then it was integrated. I'll never forget it. They used to sing Old Black Joe. And when they get to the Old Black Joe, everybody would turn around and look at me. And I felt bad that I didn't.
I used to speak Spanish in the house because I wanted my children not to forget the Spanish language. And so our prayers and everything were in Spanish, everything. And when she started school, first grade actually, because kindergarten was public school, first grade was the Catholic grade school. And I got called in by her teacher, Anan, and she said that she was surprised that this child coming from a Catholic home didn't know her prayers at all. She says, what are you doing? And I said, oh yes, she does. So I took Sister Rosanna and I says, come on. You show Sister that you know how to pray. So she started in Spanish. En el nombre del Padre, del Hijo y del Espíritu Santo. Amén. Padre nuestro que estás en los cielos, santificado, etc., etc. But she knew all her prayers in Spanish. And so the sister was surprised, really surprised. And she says, well, Mrs. Reese, it would be a good idea if you spoke nothing but English in your home so that your children will know the English language when they come to school. What a mistake that was. What a big mistake. She would have learned English just like I learned English, and she would have known the two languages fluently. But that's a mistake I made.
I worked in the refinery for 36 years. The refinery, I imagine it had about, I'm guessing 3,000 employees, and out of the 3,000 employees, there was about 3 Mexicans, and they wouldn't hire black. And like I said, there was only about 3 or 4 of us Mexicans that worked there. And because of that, you know, then the guys in there, because they were the darker skin, they would, but I went with the flow. I couldn't, it bothered me, and yet it didn't bother me because I couldn't do anything about it. And I went up the ladder. And up the ladder, I mean by different jobs. I was a laborer to begin with. Then from the laborer, I came to a helper. From a helper to a apprentice, I became a pipe fitter. And then I got into the supervision end of it. And I was superintendent of planning. And we'd have meetings, and like I said, a lot of people from the south and east would come to these meetings from different refineries, and I'd be chairing the meeting, and they didn't like it, but they couldn't do nothing about it. And I would enjoy it, because I wasn't getting back at them, but I would just enjoy it that they would. And then once we start talking the same jargon, the same things that we knew about, they would then they would change their mind. But it was always you had to prove yourself. I don't know why people are prejudiced. It's the greatest country in the world. People from every nation is here. And